Wheelchair-bound millionaire goes to a cafe and is served by a poor 8-year-old girl. What she says makes him cry. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain drummed against the windows of Mama Rosa's cafe like nature's own percussion, creating a rhythm that seemed to match Richard Wellington's hollow heartbeat. He wheeled his custom titanium chair through the narrow doorway, water dripping from his expensive coat onto the worn linoleum floor. At 45, Richard had grown accustomed to the stares, the awkward glances, the way conversations died when he entered a room. But this little cafe on the outskirts of Cleveland felt different somehow. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Faded yellow wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the red vinyl booths bore the scars of countless customers. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with something sweeter, homemade pie, perhaps. It was exactly the kind of place Richard's late wife Emma would have loved, back when love still existed in his world. "Welcome to Mama Rosa's!" came a small voice from behind the counter. Richard turned his head and felt his breath catch. Standing on a wooden milk crate, barely tall enough to see over the register, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore an apron that was far too big for her tiny frame, rolled up at the sleeves and tied in a bow that nearly reached her ankles. "Table for one, sir?" she asked with the kind of professional politeness that seemed almost comical coming from someone so young. Richard found himself staring. Yes. Just one. Right this way." She hopped down from her crate with practiced ease and grabbed a menu from the stack. Her small feet made soft pattering sounds on the floor as she led him to a corner booth near the window. As she placed the menu in front of him, Richard noticed her hands were smaller than his grandchildren's had been, before the accident took them all away. The thought sent a familiar stab of pain through his chest. "Can I start you with some coffee, sir? Mama Rosa makes the best in the neighborhood. She taught me how to brew it just right, not too strong, not too weak, but perfect for warming your heart on a day like today." There was something in her voice, a warmth that Richard hadn't heard in years. Not since Emma's voice had been silenced forever. "Coffee would be nice," he managed. The little girl, Sarah, according to her name tag, carefully poured the steaming liquid into a chip ceramic mug. Her concentration was absolute, tongue poking out slightly as she focused on not spilling a drop. "There you go, sir. Now, what brings you to our little cafe today? You don't look like you're from around here." Richard glanced down at his expensive watch, his tailored clothes, the chair that cost more than most people's cars. "I was just driving. Needed to get away from things." Sarah nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "Sometimes getting away helps us find what we're looking for, even when we don't know what that is." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Here was this child, this impossibly small human being, speaking wisdom that his army of therapists and counselors had failed to convey in 3 years of sessions. "How old are you?" he asked quietly. 8 3/4. "But Mama Rosa says I have an old soul." She paused, studying his face with eyes that seemed far too knowing. "You look sad, mister. Really, really sad. Like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time." Richard felt his throat tighten. "I suppose I have been." Sarah tilted her head considering this. Then she leaned closer, her small hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. "You know what my grandma always tells me when I'm sad? She says that sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be, right when we need to be there. Maybe you needed to find this place today. Maybe you needed to meet me." The tears came without warning, rolling down Richard's cheeks like the rain against the window. This little girl, this stranger, had somehow seen straight through to his soul with a few simple words. In a voice barely above a whisper, she had cracked open the wall he built around his heart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, wiping his eyes with a napkin. "I don't usually. It's okay to cry," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "Tears are just love with nowhere to go. And I think you've got a lot of love stored up in there, don't you?" Before Richard could answer, the bell above the door chimed, and Sarah straightened up. "I should get back to work. But sir, I hope you'll come back tomorrow. I'll be here, and I make really good pancakes. Almost as good as Mama Rosa." As she walked away, Richard sat in stunned silence, staring at the steam rising from his coffee cup. For the first time in 3 years, something had stirred in the frozen wasteland of his heart. What was it about this child that had reached him so completely? And why did he already know he'd be back tomorrow? True to his word, Richard found himself parked outside Mama Rosa's cafe at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. He barely slept, Sarah's words echoing in his mind like a persistent melody. "Tears are just love with nowhere to go. How could an 8-year-old understand something that had eluded him for 3 years? The bell chimed as he entered, and immediately Sarah's face lit up from behind the counter. "You came back! I knew you would!" She practically bounced on her milk crate with excitement. "I saved the corner table for you, just in case." As Richard wheeled toward his spot, he noticed details he'd missed yesterday. The cafe was cleaner than its shabby appearance suggested. Fresh flowers sat in mason jars on each table, dandelions and wildflowers that someone had carefully arranged. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air, making his stomach growl for the first time in months. "Mama Rosa's making her famous blueberry pancakes this morning," Sarah announced, appearing at his table with coffee already poured. "She uses real Maine blueberries and a secret ingredient that makes them taste like heaven. You seem to know everyone's favorites around here." Richard observed that Sarah's expression grew serious. "When you really listen to people, they tell you everything you need to know. Like yesterday, I could tell you hadn't eaten a real meal in a long time. You have that hollow look people get when they're feeding their body but starving their soul." Once again, her wisdom caught him off guard. "How do you know so much about people?" "Mama Rosa says I'm a people collector. I gather their stories like other kids collect baseball cards." She pulled out a worn notebook from her apron pocket. "See? I write down little things about everyone who comes in. Mrs. Henderson likes her coffee with exactly 2 sugars and 1 cream, no more, no less. Mr. Peterson always orders pie first because he says life's too short to save dessert for last." Richard watched as she flipped through pages filled with careful child's handwriting. "What did you write about me?" Sarah's cheeks reddened slightly. "That you have kind eyes that have seen too much sadness. And that you tip really, really well, even though you only ordered coffee. You noticed that? Mama Rosa says people show their character in small things. The way you said please and thank you even though you were crying. The way you made sure to push your chair in so I wouldn't trip. Rich people don't usually notice little girls like me, but you did." Before Richard could respond, a heavy-set woman with graying hair and flour-dusted hands emerged from the kitchen. Her eyes were kind but sharp, taking in every detail of Richard's expensive clothing and custom wheelchair. "So you're the gentleman who made such an impression on our Sarah," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Rosa Benedetti. This is my place." "Richard Wellington," he replied, extending his hand. "Your granddaughter is quite remarkable." Rosa's expression shifted subtly. "Sarah's not my granddaughter, Mr. Wellington. Well, that's a story for another day. But she's special, that one. Been coming here every morning before school for the past year, helping out however she can." Richard felt his heart skip. "Before school? How does she? The pancakes are ready," Sarah announced, returning with a plate stacked impossibly high. "Mama Rosa, tell him about the secret ingredient." Rosa smiled, but Richard caught something guarded in her expression. "Some secrets are worth keeping, sweetheart. Now you better eat up before these get cold." As Richard took his first bite, the flavors exploded across his taste buds. These weren't just pancakes, they were perfection. Fluffy, sweet, with bursts of blueberry that seemed to melt on his tongue. "My wife would have loved these," he said without thinking, then immediately regretted the words. Sarah's hand found his arm again. "Tell me about her." "Sarah," Rosa warned gently. "Don't pry. It's all right," Richard said quietly. "Her name was Emma. She would have sat right here and insisted on trying everyone else's food too. She said you couldn't really know a place until you tasted everything on the menu." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked softly. The question hung in the air like morning fog. Richard set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone. "The same thing that happened to everyone I loved. They left." But Sarah wasn't finished. "Did they leave because they wanted to, or because they had to?" The distinction hit him like a physical blow. In all his therapy sessions, no one had ever asked it quite that way. "They had to," he whispered. Sarah nodded solemnly. "Then they didn't really leave, did they? They're just waiting somewhere else." That afternoon, Richard found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, researching someone not for business, but out of genuine curiosity. Sitting in his penthouse office overlooking downtown Cleveland, he stared at his computer screen displaying Sarah's school enrollment records. Sarah Chin. 8 years old. Mother listed as Jennifer Chin, no father mentioned. Address, 1247 Maple Street, Unit 3B. The building was in one of Cleveland's rougher neighborhoods, the kind of place Richard's security team would have advised him to avoid. His assistant, Margaret, knocked and entered with his afternoon coffee. At 58, she'd been with Richard since before his marriage to Emma, and she knew him well enough to recognize when something had shifted. "You've been different since yesterday," she observed, setting the cup on his mahogany desk. "More present." "Have I been that absent?" Margaret considered her words carefully. "Since the accident, you've been going through the motions. Brilliant motions, mind you, the company's never been more profitable. But it's like you've been operating on autopilot." Richard leaned back in his custom ergonomic chair, designed to accommodate his paralyzed legs. "I met someone yesterday. A little girl who works at a cafe." "Works? How old is this child?" 8. "And before you say it, I know how it sounds." "But Margaret, she said something that..." He trailed off, unable to find the words. "That what?" "That made me remember who I used to be." Margaret's expression softened. "The Richard who used to visit children's hospitals every Christmas? The one who set up scholarship funds in Emma's name?" "I stopped all that after. I know why you stopped," Margaret interrupted gently. "But maybe this little girl is reminding you that helping others was never about your family. It was about who you are." Richard turned his chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below him, millions of people living their lives, facing their own struggles. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably walking home from school, that oversized apron folded neatly in her backpack. "Pull up everything you can find on Mama Rosa's cafe," he said suddenly. "Financial records, property taxes, health inspections, everything." "Richard," and discreetly, "I don't want anyone to know I'm looking." Margaret paused at the door. "Are you planning to help them?" "I don't know what I'm planning," Richard admitted. "But for the first time in 3 years, I'm planning something." 2 hours later, Margaret returned with a thick folder. "You're not going to like what I found." The documents painted a grim picture. Mama Rosa's cafe was drowning in debt. Property taxes were 6 months behind, and the building had failed its last 2 health inspections for minor violations that required expensive fixes. There were past due notices from suppliers and a foreclosure warning dated just 2 weeks prior, but it was the last document that made Richard's blood run cold. A child services report, filed anonymously, expressing concern about a minor child performing labor in a commercial establishment during school hours. "When was this filed?" Richard asked, his voice tight. 3 days ago. There's a follow-up investigation scheduled for next week." Richard felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had consumed him after the accident. But this time, it wasn't helpless rage, it was focused, purposeful. "Cancel my meetings for tomorrow," he said, already reaching for his phone. "All of them." "What are you going to do?" Richard's fingers moved across his phone screen, transferring amounts that would make most people dizzy. "Something I should have done 3 years ago." "Which is?" "Fight back." The law offices of Hartley, Morrison and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of Cleveland's most prestigious buildings. Richard had been a client for over a decade, and senior partner David Hartley dropped everything when Richard called for an emergency meeting. 24 hours notice?" David said, settling into the leather chair across from Richard's wheelchair. "This must be serious. I need you to buy a building," Richard said without preamble. 1247 Maple Street. "But I need it done quietly, through shell companies. The current owners can't know I'm involved." David raised an eyebrow. "That's a rough neighborhood, Richard. What's your interest in the property?" "There's a cafe on the ground floor. The owner is behind on rent and facing foreclosure. I want to prevent that." "Simple enough. We can handle the purchase through our Luxembourg subsidiary, then. It's not that simple." Richard slid a folder across the desk. "There's a child services investigation pending. Someone reported that an 8-year-old girl is working there." David scanned the documents, his expression growing concerned. "Richard, child labor violations are serious. If you're planning to interfere with a legitimate investigation, I'm not interfering. I'm making sure the investigation finds what it should find, that this little girl is being cared for, not exploited." "And how do you know she's being cared for?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Because I spent 2 hours with her yesterday, and she's the most remarkable child I've ever met. She's not being exploited, David. She's surviving." David leaned back, studying his longtime client. "What aren't you telling me? Her mother works 3 jobs and still can't make ends meet. The cafe owner, Rosa, has been letting Sarah help out before school in exchange for breakfast and a few dollars. It's not exploitation, it's community. The state might not see it that way. Then we'll help them see it differently." Richard pulled out his phone and showed David a bank transfer confirmation. "I've just donated $50,000 to Rosa's Cafe for kitchen renovations and code compliance." Anonymous donation, of course. David whistled low. That's generous, but it doesn't solve the child services problem. Phase 2, Richard said, producing another document. I'm establishing the Emma Wellington Foundation for At-Risk Youth. Rosa will be our first community partner. Sarah won't be working at the cafe, she'll be participating in our mentorship program. A mentorship program that happens to take place at a cafe? A mentorship program that teaches real-world skills while ensuring children get proper nutrition and adult supervision before school. Completely legal, completely legitimate. David was taking notes now, his legal mind working through the implications. What about the mother? 3 jobs suggest she's struggling financially. Richard's smile was the first genuine one David had seen from him in years. Jennifer Chin has just been selected for our new single-parent scholarship program. Full tuition for nursing school, plus living expenses. She'll be able to quit 2 of those jobs and focus on her studies. Richard, David said slowly. This is going to cost you, David. I'm worth $400 million. My wife and children are dead. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and until yesterday, I thought it was all meaningless. Richard's voice grew stronger. This little girl reminded me that money is only meaningless if you don't use it to mean something. David set down his pen. What's really going on here? This level of involvement this fast, it's not like you. Richard turned his wheelchair toward the window, watching the city below. 3 years ago, I lost everything that mattered. My wife, my 2 children, my reason for living. I've been dead inside ever since. And this child changed that? She asked me if my family left because they wanted to, or because they had to. When I said they had to, she told me they didn't really leave, they're just waiting somewhere else. Richard turned back to face David. For 3 years I've been angry at them for leaving me. I never considered that maybe they're waiting for me to start living again. David nodded slowly. So this is about Sarah, but it's also about you. Maybe. Or maybe it's about remembering that some battles are worth fighting, even when you can't win the war. All right, David said, already reaching for his phone. Let's save a cafe. Richard returned to Mama Rosa's the next morning to find the atmosphere decidedly different. Rosa moved through the cafe with nervous energy, constantly checking the door, while Sarah seemed unusually subdued as she helped arrange silverware. Everything all right? Richard asked as Sarah brought his usual coffee. She glanced toward the kitchen where Rosa was speaking in hushed, urgent tones on an old rotary phone. Someone called yesterday. About me helping here. Rosa's really scared. Richard's chest tightened. What kind of someone? The kind that takes kids away from places they love, Sarah said quietly. Rosa's been crying all morning, but she's trying to hide it. She keeps saying everything will be fine, but I can tell when grown-ups are lying. Before Richard could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a woman in a severe gray suit entered. She had short brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of someone who'd seen too much and believed too little. I'm looking for Rosa Benedetti, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of bureaucracy. Rosa emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face pale but determined. That's me. I'm Sandra Morrison from Child Protective Services. We need to discuss the report filed regarding a minor child working in this establishment. Richard watched Sarah's face crumble. The confident, wise beyond her years little girl suddenly looked exactly like what she was, a frightened 8-year-old who didn't understand why the world was trying to take away her safe place. There must be some mistake, Rosa said, her voice shaking slightly. Sarah doesn't work here. She's just, ma'am, I have a detailed report describing a child performing duties typically reserved for employees. Serving customers, handling food, operating behind the counter. Ms. Morrison pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. Is there a child present who matches that description? Rosa's eyes flicked to Sarah, who had gone very still. She helps out sometimes, just little things. Is she compensated for this help? The question hung in the air like a sword. Richard could see Rosa calculating, trying to find an answer that wouldn't make things worse. She gets breakfast, and sometimes, so she is compensated. Ma'am, child labor laws exist for a reason. Children belong in school, not in commercial kitchens. Sarah stepped forward, her small chin raised defiantly. I go to school. I'm in 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, and I have perfect attendance. You can check. Ms. Morrison's expression softened slightly as she looked at Sarah, but her voice remained official. That's good, honey. But you shouldn't be working before school. That's not appropriate for someone your age. I'm not working, Sarah said firmly. I'm helping my friend Rosa because she's sad and lonely, and helping friends isn't against the law. Sarah, Rosa warned. It's true. Sarah's voice rose, tears beginning to form. Rosa lost her husband last year, and she doesn't have any family, and this cafe is all she has left in the world. I help her because that's what people do, they help each other. Richard felt something shift inside him, the same feeling he'd experienced when he'd first heard Sarah speak. Here was this child, facing down a government official who could potentially destroy her little world, and she was defending Rosa instead of herself. Young lady, Ms. Morrison said, her tone gentler now. I understand you want to help your friend. But there are rules that don't make sense. Sarah interrupted. You want to protect me, but from what? From learning how to cook? From spending time with someone who loves me? From feeling useful and important? Her voice cracked. My mom works 3 jobs and is never home. Rosa is the only one who asks about my day and makes sure I eat breakfast and tells me I'm smart and special. How is protecting me from that helping me? Silence fell over the cafe. Ms. Morrison stared at Sarah, clearly unprepared for such an articulate defense from an 8-year-old. Rosa looked like she might faint. And Richard realized he was about to do something that would either save this situation or make it infinitely worse. Excuse me, he said, wheeling his chair closer to the social worker. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Ms. Morrison turned to him with mild annoyance. Sir, this is official business, Richard Wellington, he said, extending his hand. And I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The name clearly meant something to her. Ms. Morrison's demeanor shifted to professional wariness. The Richard Wellington? Wellington Industries? Sarah isn't working here. Richard continued smoothly. She's participating in our pilot mentorship program through the Emma Wellington Foundation for At-Risk Youth. Sarah's eyes widened, but she remained silent. Rosa looked confused but hopeful. I'm not familiar with this program, Ms. Morrison said carefully. Richard pulled out his phone and showed her an official-looking document that Margaret had emailed him 20 minutes earlier. We launched it last month. Rosa's Cafe is our first community partner. Sarah and several other children receive mentoring in real-world skills, nutrition education, and emotional support before school hours. Ms. Morrison studied the document, her frown deepening. This appears legitimate, but I'll need to verify, of course. You'll find all our paperwork in order. We're fully licensed, insured, and in compliance with all state regulations regarding youth programs. Richard's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. Perhaps the person who filed the report wasn't aware of our program's existence. Perhaps, Ms. Morrison said slowly. But I'll still need to conduct a full investigation, naturally. We welcome oversight. In fact, I'd love to show you our curriculum. Richard gestured toward Sarah. Sarah, would you mind demonstrating some of the skills you've learned through our program? Sarah, clearly understanding that this was some kind of performance, straightened up. Well, I've learned about nutrition and food safety. Like how you always wash your hands before handling food, and how to check that eggs aren't cracked before using them. And I've learned about customer service, how treating people with kindness makes them want to come back. And what else? Richard prompted. Math skills through calculating change and measuring ingredients. Reading skills through taking orders and reading recipes. And, Sarah looked directly at Richard. I've learned that sometimes the most important lesson is recognizing when someone needs help, and being brave enough to do something about it. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. This child, this incredible, wise, brave little girl, was describing exactly what she'd done for him yesterday. Ms. Morrison looked between Richard, Sarah, and Rosa, clearly trying to piece together what was really happening. Mr. Wellington, this program sounds comprehensive. But I'll need to see official documentation, speak with the child's mother, and already arranged, Richard said. Jennifer Chin will be here this afternoon. She's very supportive of Sarah's participation in our program. Which was true, assuming Jennifer agreed to what Richard was about to propose. Ms. Morrison closed her tablet with a snap. I'll be back tomorrow with a full inspection team. If everything is as you say, there won't be any problems. But if I find that this program is just a cover for child labor, you won't, Richard said confidently. Because it isn't. After Ms. Morrison left, the cafe fell silent. Rosa sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Sarah looked back and forth between the adults, clearly understanding that something important had just happened but not quite sure what. Mr. Wellington, Rosa said finally. I don't understand. What foundation? What program? Richard turned to face both of them, his expression serious. The foundation that's going to save this cafe, provide for Sarah's future, and give me a reason to get up in the morning again. But how? Rosa, yesterday Sarah saved my life without even knowing it. Today, I'm returning the favor. Jennifer Chin arrived at Mama Rosa's cafe at exactly 3 o'clock, her hospital scrubs wrinkled from a double shift, and exhaustion etched into every line of her 30-year-old face. She'd received Richard's call 2 hours earlier, and the conversation had left her alternately hopeful and terrified. You must be Jennifer, Richard said as she approached his table. Thank you for coming. Jennifer's eyes moved from Richard to Sarah, who was pretending to do homework in the corner booth but clearly listening to every word. Sarah, baby, come here. Sarah practically flew into her mother's arms. Mom, this is Mr. Richard. He's the one I told you about, the one who likes my pancakes. Jennifer studied Richard with the wariness of a single mother who'd learned to be suspicious of men offering too good to be true opportunities. My daughter says you want to help us. In my experience, help always comes with a price. You're right to be cautious, Richard said. But before we discuss my offer, I need to understand something. How did Sarah end up working here? Jennifer's face flushed with shame. She doesn't work here. She just, Mom, Sarah interrupted gently. It's okay. Mr. Richard isn't like the other people. He understands about helping. Jennifer looked at her daughter, then at Rosa, who was nervously wiping down tables despite their obvious cleanliness. Finally, she sank into the chair across from Richard. I work 3 jobs, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Night shift at Cleveland General, morning shift at a medical clinic, and weekend shifts at a pharmacy. Sarah's 8, but she's been taking care of herself since she was 6. Richard felt his chest tighten. Taking care of herself how? Getting herself up for school, making her own breakfast, or trying to. Walking herself to school, coming home to an empty apartment. Jennifer's voice cracked. I know it's not right. I know she needs more than I can give her. But I can't afford childcare, and I can't afford to work fewer hours. So she started coming here? Jennifer nodded, tears beginning to flow. About a year ago, she discovered this place on her way to school. Rosa found her outside one morning, crying because she was hungry and scared to go to school on an empty stomach. I was having nightmares, Sarah added quietly, about being alone. Rosa let me sit in the corner and do my homework while she made breakfast. She never asked for anything in return. But I couldn't let her just give away food. Jennifer continued. We don't take charity. So I asked if Sarah could help a little bit, just to earn her breakfast. Rosa finally spoke up. It was never about the work. She's a little girl, not an employee. But she needed to feel useful, needed to feel wanted. And honestly, Rosa's voice broke. I needed the company. Since my husband died, this place has been so quiet. Richard absorbed this information, his mind racing. Jennifer, what would it take for you to quit one of your jobs? Or 2? I can't afford to quit anything. These jobs barely cover rent and groceries as it is. What if I told you that you'd been accepted into Cleveland State's accelerated nursing program, with full tuition paid and a monthly stipend for living expenses? Jennifer stared at him. I applied for that program 2 years ago. I was waitlisted. Richard pulled out his phone and showed her an email. You were just accepted. Congratulations. How is that possible? Because sometimes the right person makes a phone call to the right people. Richard's voice was matter-of-fact. The Wellington family has been major donors to Cleveland State for 20 years. When I explain that we're sponsoring a brilliant single mother who's been caring for sick people while raising a remarkable daughter, they tend to listen. Jennifer's hands shook as she read the email. This says I start in 2 weeks. Mr. Wellington, I can't accept this. I don't even know you. You know I love your daughter's pancakes, Richard said with a slight smile. And you know she trusted me enough to share them with me. Sometimes that's enough. But why? What do you want from us? Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the coffee cup in his hands. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and children in a car accident. The other driver was drunk. He walked away without a scratch while my family died. The cafe fell completely silent. Since then, I've been dying slowly, piece by piece. I've got more money than I know what to do with, but I lost my purpose, my reason for living. He looked up at Sarah, who was watching him with those wise, ancient eyes. Yesterday, your daughter reminded me that love doesn't disappear when people die, it just needs new places to go. I don't understand, Jennifer whispered. I want to invest in your family's future. Not as charity, but as partnership. Sarah will participate in an educational mentorship program here at the cafe. You'll go to nursing school and build a career that can support both of you properly. And I'll remember what it feels like to be part of something that matters. Sarah suddenly spoke up. Mom, remember what you always tell me about guardian angels? Jennifer nodded through her tears. You said that sometimes God sends people to help us just when we need it most, but we have to be brave enough to say yes. Sarah looked at Richard with absolute certainty. I think Mr. Richard is our guardian angel. Sarah, Jennifer began. And I think we're his guardian angels too. Because he was lost, and we helped him find his way home. Richard felt tears threatening again. This child's ability to see straight to the heart of things was both gift and miracle. There's one more thing, Richard said quietly. The Emma Wellington Foundation isn't just a cover story to keep Sarah safe here. I want to make it real. This cafe will be our headquarters, Rosa will be our community coordinator, and Sarah will be our first success story. What does that mean? Rosa asked. It means this cafe becomes a safe place for kids who need somewhere to go before school, after school, or during the summer. It means we teach them real skills while making sure they're fed and cared for. It means we help families like yours find stability and hope. Richard turned his wheelchair to face all three of them. It means we build something beautiful out of something broken. Together. Jennifer looked at her daughter, then at Rosa, then back at Richard. If we say yes to this, if we trust you, promise me it's not just about easing your conscience. Promise me you're in this for the long term. Richard met her gaze steadily. Jennifer, yesterday I was planning my own death. Today I'm planning a future. I think that tells you everything you need to know about how serious I am. Sarah suddenly jumped up and threw her arms around Richard's neck. Does this mean I get to keep helping Rosa? And you'll keep coming for pancakes? And Mom won't have to work so many jobs? It means all of that and more, Richard said, hugging her back with an intensity that surprised him. It means we're family now. Outside, the first snowfall of the season began to dust the windows of Mama Rosa's cafe, but inside, something warmer than any fire had just been kindled, the kind of warmth that comes from broken people choosing to heal each other. 2 weeks into the Emma Wellington Foundation's operation, Richard arrived at Mama Rosa's to find chaos. Sarah stood in the middle of the cafe, tears streaming down her face, while a boy roughly her age sat defiantly in the corner booth with his arms crossed. Rosa looked frazzled, flour in her hair and exhaustion etched across her features. What's happening here? Richard asked, wheeling quickly to Sarah's side. Tommy won't listen, Sarah sobbed. He threw his breakfast on the floor and called Rosa a stupid old lady, and when I tried to talk to him, he said I was just a stuck-up know-it-all who thinks she's better than everyone. Richard turned his attention to the boy in the corner. Tommy Martinez was 8 years old, according to the file Richard had memorized, living with his grandmother after his parents' arrest on drug charges. He was the Foundation's second participant, referred by Sarah's school counselor. Tommy, Richard said calmly, approaching the boy's table. Want to tell me what's really going on? Don't care, Tommy muttered, not looking up. This whole thing is stupid anyway. I don't need some rich guy pretending to care about me. The words stung because they echoed Richard's own cynical thoughts from just weeks ago. You're right to be suspicious. Most adults who say they want to help usually disappoint you, don't they? Tommy's head snapped up, surprised by the honesty. Yeah. So what? So I'm not most adults. I'm someone who lost everything and found out that helping people like you and Sarah is the only thing that makes life worth living again. Richard wheeled closer. But I can't force you to trust me. Trust has to be earned. My grandma says rich people only help when there's something in it for them. Your grandmother sounds smart. So what do you think is in this for me? Tommy considered this, his defiance wavering slightly. I don't know. Maybe you want to feel good about yourself. Maybe you need it for taxes or something. Those are both possibilities, Richard agreed. Or maybe I see a boy who's scared and angry and hurting, and I remember what it felt like to be all those things. You were never like me, Tommy scoffed. You probably had everything handed to you. Richard was quiet for a moment, then began rolling up his sleeve. See this scar? He showed Tommy a long, jagged mark running from his wrist to his elbow. I got this when I was 9, trying to crawl through a broken window to get into my own house because my father had locked me out again. Tommy's eyes widened slightly. I grew up in foster care, Tommy. 12 different homes before I turned 18. Some good, some terrible, most just indifferent. I know what it's like to be hungry, to be scared, to wonder if anyone in the world actually gives a damn whether you live or die. The cafe had gone completely silent. Sarah stared at Richard with new understanding, while Rosa quietly began cleaning up Tommy's spilled breakfast. The difference between you and me, Richard continued, is that I got lucky. A teacher believed in me, helped me get a scholarship to college. But luck shouldn't be required for a kid to have a chance at a decent life. Tommy's voice was smaller now. So what makes you think you can help me? Because I'm not trying to save you, Tommy. I'm trying to give you tools and opportunities. What you do with them is up to you. Richard gestured toward Sarah, who was watching anxiously. Sarah believes you can do great things. That's why she asked us to invite you into the program. Sarah asked for me? Sarah stepped forward hesitantly. I told Mr. Richard about how you helped me when Marcus was picking on me at school. And how you're really good at math, even though you pretend you're not. I thought maybe you'd like it here. Tommy looked between Sarah and Richard, his wall of anger beginning to crack. I don't know how to do this stuff. I've never worked in a restaurant. Neither had Sarah when she started, Rosa said gently, approaching with a fresh plate of pancakes. But she was willing to learn, and willing to let us teach her. That's all we ask? Tommy stared at the pancakes, and Richard could practically see the internal battle playing out on his face. Finally, the boy reached for the fork. These better be good, he mumbled. Best in Cleveland, Sarah said with a watery smile. Want me to show you how Rosa makes them? As Richard watched Tommy take his first tentative bite, then immediately reach for another forkful, he felt something shift inside his chest. This was harder than he'd anticipated, not the logistics of running a foundation, but the emotional investment required. Every child who walked through that door carried wounds that couldn't be healed with money or good intentions alone. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Channel 8 News called. They want to do a feature story on the foundation. Thoughts? Richard looked around the cafe, at Sarah patiently explaining to Tommy how to measure coffee grounds, at Rosa showing both children how to properly wash dishes, at the simple magic of broken people choosing to trust each other. He texted back. Not yet. We're still figuring out who we are. But even as he typed the words, Richard knew that wasn't entirely true. They weren't figuring out who they were becoming who they were meant to be. The question was whether they were strong enough to survive the growing pains. Over the next hour, Richard watched Tommy gradually relax. The boy had natural leadership abilities and a quick wit that emerged once he felt safe. He made Sarah laugh with his impression of their school principal, and he caught on quickly to Rosa's techniques for mixing pancake batter. You know, Tommy said as they cleaned up, this isn't as terrible as I thought it would be. High praise, Richard said with a smile. I mean, it's still weird having a rich guy want to hang around with us. But I guess if you're gonna be weird, at least you're useful weird. Sarah giggled. Tommy, you can't call Mr. Richard weird. It's all right, Richard said. I've been called worse things by much less perceptive people. As the morning drew to a close and the children prepared for school, Tommy approached Richard's wheelchair hesitantly. Mr. Richard? Can I ask you something? Of course. When you were a kid like me, did you ever think you'd turn out okay? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He remembered being 8 years old, standing in yet another social worker's office, wondering if anyone would ever want him permanently. Honestly? No. I thought I was broken beyond repair. I thought I'd always be angry and alone. But you're not. Not anymore. It took a long time, and a lot of help from good people. But no, I'm not broken anymore. Richard looked at Tommy seriously. And neither are you. You're just bent a little, and bent things can be straightened out with enough patience and care. Tommy nodded, processing this. Okay. I'll try to remember that when things get hard. And when you forget, Sarah and Rosa and I will remind you. After the children left for school, Rosa collapsed into a chair with a deep sigh. That was exhausting, she said. But good exhausting, you know? Richard nodded. How many more referrals do we have coming? 3 more this week. The school counselor is very excited about the program. Rosa, are you sure you're up for this? It's going to get more complicated before it gets easier. Rosa looked around her cafe, at the flowers Sarah had arranged that morning, at the artwork Tommy had already started pinning to the bulletin board, at the sense of purpose that had filled the empty spaces left by her husband's death. Mr. Richard, 6 months ago I was ready to close this place and give up. Now I wake up every morning knowing that children are counting on me to be here, to be strong, to be their safe harbor in whatever storms they're facing. She smiled. I haven't felt this alive since my husband died. Richard understood exactly what she meant. Then we keep going. But Rosa, I need you to promise me something. What? If this becomes too much, if you need help or support or just a break, you'll tell me. These children need stability, and that means we need to take care of ourselves first. I promise. But Richard? I think you need to make the same promise. You're investing more than money in this foundation, you're investing your heart. And hearts can break if they're not handled carefully. As Richard left the cafe that morning, Rosa's words echoed in his mind. She was right. He was emotionally invested in a way he hadn't been since before the accident. It felt dangerous and necessary at the same time, like learning to breathe again after nearly drowning. But for the first time in 3 years, the risk felt worth taking. Richard's peaceful Tuesday morning was shattered by an urgent call from David Hartley at 7 a.m. "We have a problem," the lawyer said without preamble. "Someone's been asking questions about your foundation." "Detailed questions?" Richard sat up in bed, immediately alert. "What kind of questions?" "Financial records, tax exemption status, licensing requirements." "But the concerning part is who's asking," Marcus Bennett from the Cleveland Herald. "He's an investigative journalist with a reputation for taking down charities he considers fraudulent." "Fraudulent?" "We've been operating for exactly 3 weeks. That's what makes this suspicious. Someone tipped him off, Richard. Someone who knows enough about your operation to suggest there's a story worth pursuing." Richard's mind raced through the possibilities. "How much does he know?" "According to my source at the paper, he knows about your purchase of the building, the anonymous donations to Rosa's Cafe, and your sudden interest in child welfare. He also knows about Sarah specifically." The mention of Sarah's name sent ice through Richard's veins. If he publishes anything that puts that child in danger, that's not the worst part. He's been asking about your family. About the accident. I think he's planning to angle this as a wealthy man exploiting vulnerable children to deal with his own trauma. Richard was already reaching for his wheelchair. "When does his story run?" "Unknown." "But Richard, there's something else. Bennett requested an interview with Jennifer Chin." "Did she agree?" "She called me instead of him, which is good. But she's scared. She thinks this might affect her nursing school placement, and she's worried about what this kind of attention might mean for Sarah." Richard transferred to his chair with practiced efficiency. "Schedule a meeting with Jennifer and Rosa for this afternoon." "And David?" "Find out who's feeding information to Bennett. This kind of detailed intelligence doesn't come from public records." 3 hours later, Richard sat in Mama Rosa's cafe feeling like he was preparing for battle. Jennifer had arrived early, her nurse's training evident in her calm demeanor despite obvious stress. Rosa paced behind the counter, her nervous energy filling the small space. "Tell me exactly what the reporter asked you," Richard said to Jennifer. "He wanted to know about Sarah's relationship with you. How long you'd known each other, whether you'd ever been alone with her, whether you'd given our family money or gifts." Jennifer's voice was tight with controlled anger. "He made it sound like something inappropriate was happening." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I hung up and called your lawyer." "But Mr. Wellington, I need to know, is there anything about this foundation that could hurt Sarah? Because if there is, I'll pull her out right now." Richard met her gaze steadily. "Jennifer, everything we've done has been legal, ethical, and in Sarah's best interests. But you're right to be concerned. Sometimes the appearance of impropriety can be just as damaging as actual impropriety." "So what do we do?" Rosa asked. "We get ahead of the story. We control the narrative before Bennett can twist it." Richard pulled out his phone. "Margaret, I need you to call Channel 8 News. Tell them we're ready for that feature story they wanted." "Richard," David warned. "Going public now, when you're under investigation, could backfire spectacularly. Or it could show people exactly what we're really doing here." Richard turned to Jennifer and Rosa. "But I won't make this decision for you. If we do this interview, your faces and stories will be public. Sarah will be in the spotlight. You need to decide if you're comfortable with that." Jennifer looked at her daughter, who had been unusually quiet during the adult conversation. "Sarah, baby, what do you think?" Sarah, who had been coloring at the corner table while listening to every word, looked up with those wise 8-year-old eyes. "I think bad people try to make good things look bad because they don't understand what good things actually look like," she said matter-of-factly. "And I think if we let them scare us into hiding, then they win." "But sweetheart," Jennifer said gently, "if we do this interview, lots of people will know our story. Some of them might not be nice about it." Sarah considered this with the gravity she brought to all important decisions. "Mom, remember what you taught me about bullies at school? That you stand up to them by being brave and telling the truth. Well, this reporter person sounds like a bully to me. He's trying to make Mr. Richard look bad for helping us, and he's trying to make you scared of being helped. Sarah set down her crayon with determination. I think we should tell everyone the truth about what really happens here, so they can see how wrong he is. Richard felt that familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Sarah displayed wisdom beyond her years. You understand that once we do this, there's no going back? People will always know your story. Good, Sarah said simply. Maybe our story will help other kids who need help find places like this. Rosa wiped her eyes with her apron. That little girl has more courage than most adults I know. So we're doing this? Richard asked. Jennifer nodded slowly. We're doing this. But I have conditions. Name them. The interview happens here, in the cafe, with all of us present. No one talks to Sarah alone, and if anyone makes her uncomfortable, the interview stops immediately. Agreed. And Mr. Wellington? When they ask you why you're really doing this, and they will ask, I want you to tell them the truth. Not some sanitized version designed to make you look good. The real truth. Richard was quiet for a moment. Jennifer, the real truth is complicated and painful and might not make me look sympathetic. The real truth is what separates us from people like this Bennett character. It's what makes this whole thing authentic instead of just another rich man's charity project. All right. The real truth it is. As Richard made the call to Channel 8, he felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff. The smart thing would be to step back, to handle this quietly through lawyers and public relations firms. But watching Sarah return to her coloring with complete confidence in their decision, he realized that playing it safe had never gotten him anything worth having. Sometimes the only way forward was to jump and trust that someone would be there to catch you. Or in this case, to trust that an 8-year-old girl's faith in the power of truth would be stronger than a journalist's cynicism. The interview was scheduled for tomorrow at 10 a.m. By tomorrow night, their little family would either be vindicated or destroyed. Richard just hoped they were strong enough to survive either outcome. Channel 8's mobile news truck arrived at Mama Rosa's cafe at exactly 9:30 a.m., followed closely by a sedan containing Marcus Bennett from the Cleveland Herald. Richard watched from the window as the investigative journalist stood on the sidewalk, taking notes and photos with the intensity of someone building a case. He looks angry, Sarah observed, peering over Richard's shoulder. He looks like someone who's already decided what story he wants to tell, Richard replied. Our job is to show him a different story. Jennifer emerged from the bathroom, having changed into her best blouse and carefully applied makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes. I barely slept, she admitted. I keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. It's going to be fine, Rosa said, though her own hands shook as she arranged pastries on the display counter. We're just going to tell the truth. The Channel 8 crew was led by Rebecca Martinez, a veteran journalist with kind eyes and a reputation for fair reporting. She spent several minutes walking through the cafe, understanding the layout and the story they wanted to tell. This feels authentic, she said to Richard. Too many charity stories happen in sterile boardrooms or staged photo ops. This place has real history. That's because this isn't a photo op, Richard replied. This is our life. Rebecca's cameraman, a quiet man named Steve, began setting up equipment, while Rebecca conducted brief pre-interviews with each participant. When she spoke with Sarah, Richard was amazed by the child's composure. Are you nervous about being on television? Rebecca asked. A little, Sarah said honestly. But my mom says when you're telling the truth, you don't have to worry about remembering what you said. That's very wise. What do you want people to know about this place? Sarah looked around the cafe with obvious affection. That it's not about the money or the food or even the learning. It's about having somewhere you belong. Rebecca's expression softened. Can you explain what you mean by that? Before I met Mr. Richard and started coming here every day, I felt like I was just floating around, you know? Like I was taking up space but not really part of anything important. Sarah's voice grew stronger. But here I'm needed. Rosa needs me to help her remember to smile, Mr. Richard needs me to remind him that good things can still happen, and Mom needs me to show her that taking help doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart. Rebecca glanced at Richard with new understanding. And what does this place give you, Sarah? A family that chose me instead of just being stuck with me. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. In all his planning for this interview, he never considered that Sarah might articulate something he couldn't. Okay, Rebecca said, clearly moved. I think we're ready to begin. The live segment started at exactly 10 a.m. Rebecca introduced the story as an investigation into innovative approaches to child welfare, deliberately framing it as educational rather than suspicious. I'm here at Mama Rosa's Cafe in Cleveland, where an unusual partnership is changing the lives of local children," she began. "With me is Richard Wellington, founder of the Emma Wellington Foundation for At-Risk Youth, along with cafe owner Rosa Benedetti and foundation participants Sarah Chen and Jennifer Chin." The first questions were softballs, allowing each person to explain their role in the foundation. Richard watched Rebecca carefully, recognizing the technique of establishing credibility before asking harder questions. "Mr. Wellington," Rebecca said, transitioning to more challenging territory, "some critics might argue that a wealthy businessman suddenly developing an interest in child welfare seems convenient, especially given your family's tragic history. How do you respond to suggestions that this foundation is more about healing your own trauma than helping children?" Richard had anticipated this question, but hearing it asked while Sarah sat beside him made it feel different. More personal and more important. "Rebecca, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending my motivation is purely altruistic. You're absolutely right that this foundation grew out of my own pain." He looked directly into the camera. 3 years ago, I lost my wife Emma and our 2 children in a car accident. Since then, I've been essentially dead inside, going through the motions of living without any real purpose." Sarah reached over and took his hand, a gesture so natural that Richard wondered if she'd planned it. "But here's what changed," Richard continued. "I met Sarah, and she reminded me that love doesn't disappear when people die, it just needs new places to go. If this foundation helps me heal while helping children build better futures, I can't see how that's a bad thing." "Sarah," Rebecca turned to the child, "some adults might worry that accepting help from someone you barely know could be dangerous. Were you ever scared of Mr. Richard?" Sarah considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "No, because scared feelings and careful feelings are different. Mom taught me to be careful about strangers, so I watched Mr. Richard for a long time before I decided he was safe." "What made you decide he was safe?" "The way he said please and thank you even when he was crying. And the way he pushed his chair in so I wouldn't trip. People who notice little things about other people are usually the ones you can trust." Rebecca nodded, clearly impressed by Sarah's maturity. "Jennifer, as Sarah's mother, what convinced you to allow your daughter to participate in this program?" Jennifer had been quiet during most of the interview, but now she leaned forward with visible determination. "Ms. Martinez, I've been working 3 jobs for the past 2 years, barely keeping our heads above water. I've applied for every assistance program available, been on waiting lists for affordable housing and childcare, and still couldn't provide my daughter with the stability she deserves." Jennifer's voice grew stronger. "When Mr. Wellington offered us a path to a better life, my first instinct was suspicion. But then I realized something. I was so focused on protecting Sarah from potential danger that I was failing to protect her from actual poverty." "Can you elaborate on that?" "Sarah was coming home to an empty apartment every day, making her own meals, doing her homework alone, going to bed wondering if I'd be home before she fell asleep. That's not protection, that's neglect, even if it's well-intentioned neglect." Jennifer looked at Richard with obvious gratitude. "Mr. Wellington didn't just offer Sarah a mentorship program. He offered our entire family a chance at stability." Rebecca turned back to Richard. "Mr. Wellington, what do you say to people who might view this as a wealthy man buying a family's loyalty?" Before Richard could answer, Sarah spoke up. "Ms. Martinez, can I say something?" "Of course. People who think Mr. Richard bought us don't understand what buying actually means. When you buy something, you own it, right? But Mr. Richard doesn't own us. He freed us. Can you explain the difference?" Sarah's 8-year-old wisdom shone through as she spoke. "Before, Mom had to work 3 jobs because she didn't have any choices. Now she can choose to go to nursing school because Mr. Richard gave her choices. Before, I had to take care of myself because Mom couldn't be home. Now I get to help Rosa and learn new things because Mr. Richard made it safe for Mom to work less." Sarah looked directly into the camera with startling intensity. "When you buy something, it can't say no to you. But any of us can walk away from this program anytime we want. That's not buying, that's giving." The cafe fell silent except for the hum of the camera. Rebecca stared at Sarah with obvious amazement, and Richard realized that this 8-year-old had just delivered the most powerful defense of their program that anyone could have crafted. "Sarah," Rebecca said softly, "what do you want people to understand about this place?" Sarah looked around the cafe at Rosa, at her mother, at Richard, and finally back at the camera. "I want them to understand that families aren't just the people you're born with. Sometimes they're the people who choose to love you when you need it most. And I want other kids who feel alone to know that somewhere, there are adults who want to help them find where they belong." As Rebecca wrapped up the segment, Richard felt a mix of pride and terror. They told their story honestly and powerfully, but now it was out of their control. By tonight, thousands of people would have opinions about their little family. What Richard didn't know was that one of those viewers would be someone from his past, someone whose appearance would threaten everything they built together. The phone call came at 11 p.m., 3 hours after the Channel 8 segment aired. Richard had been monitoring social media response to the broadcast, mostly positive, with several families inquiring about the foundation's services, when his personal cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Richard Wellington? The voice was familiar but older, weathered by time and bitterness. Yes? It's Frank Morrison. I saw your little dog and pony show on the news tonight. Richard's blood turned to ice. Frank Morrison had been the drunk driver who killed his family. The man had served 18 months in prison and been released 6 months ago. What do you want, Frank? I want to talk. In person. Tomorrow. I have nothing to say to you. Oh, but I have plenty to say to you. See, I've been watching you play saint on television, talking about love and healing and helping children. Makes for a real heartwarming story. Frank's voice turned ugly. What the good people of Cleveland don't know is what kind of man you really are. Richard's hands began to shake. What's that supposed to mean? It means I know about the threats you made while I was in prison. The money you offered to have me killed. The private investigators you hired to destroy my life. Frank laughed bitterly. Hard to reconcile that vengeful piece of garbage with the saint they interviewed tonight. That was grief talking. I never actually. Doesn't matter what you actually did, Rich. What matters is what people will think when they find out. How's your little angel Sarah going to feel when she learns her hero spent 2 years plotting murder? Richard felt the room spinning around him. Everything Frank was saying was true. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, consumed by rage and grief, Richard had indeed hired people to investigate ways to destroy Frank's life. He'd never acted on any of it, but the intent had been real. What do you want? Richard asked quietly. Meet me tomorrow at Riverside Park, noon. Come alone. We're going to have a conversation about the future. The line went dead. Richard sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights, feeling the foundation of his new life cracking beneath him. The next morning, Richard arrived at the cafe to find Sarah already there, bubbling with excitement about the previous night's broadcast. Mr. Richard, did you see all the nice things people wrote about us online? Rosa showed me on her computer. There's a family in Chicago who wants to start their own program like ours. Richard forced a smile, but Sarah's perceptive eyes caught the tension immediately. You look sad again. Like you did that first day, but different sad. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired. Sarah studied his face with uncomfortable intensity. Are you lying to me? The direct question caught Richard off guard. Sarah had an uncanny ability to cut through adult evasions and get straight to truth. No, he said carefully. I'm not lying. I am tired. But there's something else too. Is it bad? Richard looked at this child who had become so important to him, who trusted him completely, who had defended him on television with the fierce loyalty of family. The thought of her learning about his darkest impulses made him physically ill. I hope not. But Sarah, I need you to remember something, okay? Okay. Sometimes people do things when they're hurting that they wouldn't normally do. And sometimes those things come back to cause problems later, even when the person has changed and become better. Sarah considered this with her characteristic gravity. Are you in trouble? I might be. Because of something you did before you met me? Yes. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand with both of hers. Mr. Richard, do you remember what you told Tommy about being bent but not broken? Richard nodded. Well, I think all grown-ups have bent parts from when life hurt them. The important thing isn't what bent you, it's whether you let the bent parts make you mean or make you kind. And what if the bent parts made me do mean things? Sarah's eyes filled with wisdom that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old. Then you stop doing mean things and start doing kind things instead. That's what growing means. What if other people can't forgive the mean things? Then that's their problem, not yours. You can't control what other people think, Mr. Richard. You can only control what kind of person you choose to be today. Richard felt tears threatening. How did you get so smart? Life made me smart the same way it made you sad. But being smart and being sad don't have to be permanent if you don't want them to be. An hour later, Richard sat on a bench in Riverside Park, watching Frank Morrison approach. The man looked older than his 48 years, his face bearing the weight of guilt and alcohol abuse. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose life had been permanently destabilized. You look good, Rich. Healthy. Happy even. Frank sat down beside him uninvited. Must be nice, having all that money to buy yourself a new family. What do you want, Frank? I want you to remember what you did to me. The investigators who showed up at my mother's house, asking questions about my childhood. The employers who mysteriously lost my job applications. The landlords who suddenly decided I wasn't suitable as a tenant. Richard had forgotten none of it. In his grief-fueled rage, he'd used his wealth and connections to systematically destroy every opportunity Frank had tried to pursue after prison. You made it impossible for me to rebuild my life, Frank continued. And now I'm supposed to watch you on television, playing saint with some little girl, talking about healing and forgiveness? What happened to my family was my fault. I know that. I've lived with that guilt every day for 3 years. But what you did afterward, that was just cruelty. Richard stared at the playground across the park, where children Sarah's age were laughing and playing, oblivious to the adult complications that could shatter their worlds. You're right, he said quietly. What I did was wrong. Frank seemed surprised by the admission. So what are you going to do about it? What do you want me to do about it? I want you to face consequences. I want the people who think you're some kind of hero to know what you're really capable of. And if I don't agree to that? Frank smiled coldly. Then I call the Cleveland Herald. That investigative reporter who's been sniffing around your foundation? I'm sure he'd love to hear about the Real Richard Wellington. Richard felt the walls closing in. Everything he built with Sarah and Jennifer and Rosa, all the good they were doing, all the healing that had begun, Frank could destroy it all with a single phone call. I need time to think about this, Richard said. You have 24 hours. Tomorrow at noon, you either call a press conference and tell the truth about what you did to me, or I tell it for you. As Frank walked away, Richard remained on the bench, staring at the playground where innocent children played games with simple rules and fair outcomes. He thought about Sarah's words that morning, about bent parts and choosing kindness over meanness. But some bent parts, Richard realized, might be too damaged to ever straighten completely, and some consequences might be too severe to escape, no matter how much good you tried to do afterward. Richard didn't go to the cafe the next morning. Instead, he sat in his penthouse office, staring at a draft press release that would destroy everything he'd built over the past month. David Hartley sat across from him, having spent the night crafting legal strategies to minimize the damage. We could fight this, David said for the third time. Morrison's credibility is questionable. He's an ex-convict with obvious motivation to discredit you. Everything he's saying is true, David. I did all those things. Yes, but context matters. You were grieving. Grief doesn't excuse what I did. Richard turned his chair toward the windows overlooking the city. I used my wealth and power to systematically destroy a man's life out of pure vengeance. How is that different from any other abuse of power? Because you stopped. Because you changed. Because you're helping people now. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Rosa. Sarah keeps asking where you are. Should I be worried? The thought of facing Sarah with this hanging over him made Richard's chest tighten. How do you explain to a child that her hero was capable of sustained cruelty? I have to tell them, Richard said suddenly. Richard, that's not advisable. I have to tell Sarah and Jennifer and Rosa the truth before Morrison does. They deserve to hear it from me. If you do that, you're essentially committing professional suicide. The foundation will be finished. Richard was quiet for a long moment. David, what if that's the right outcome? What if someone like me shouldn't be around children? Don't be ridiculous. You've done more good in the past month than most people do in a lifetime. Built on a lie of omission. Richard's personal phone rang. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen. Mr. Wellington? I'm sorry to bother you, but Sarah is really upset. She says something's wrong with you, and she wants to help fix it. She's been crying for the past hour. The image of Sarah crying because of him was unbearable. I'll be right there. Richard, David started. I'm going to tell them everything. All of it. Then I'm going to let them decide whether they want me in their lives. 30 minutes later, Richard sat in the back corner of Mama Rosa's cafe, looking at 3 faces that had become his family. Sarah's eyes were red from crying, Jennifer looked worried, and Rosa seemed prepared for bad news. There's something I need to tell you, Richard began. Something about who I was before I met you, Sarah. Is it about the bent parts? Sarah asked quietly. Yes. Very bent parts. Richard took a deep breath and began to tell them about Frank Morrison. About the drunk driving accident that killed his family. About the rage and grief that consumed him afterward. and about the systematic campaign of revenge he'd waged against the man who destroyed his life. He told them about the private investigators, the employment sabotage, the housing discrimination he'd orchestrated. He explained how he'd used his wealth and connections to ensure that Frank Morrison could never rebuild his life after prison. "I didn't just want him to pay for what he did," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to lose everything, the way I lost everything." The cafe was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. Sarah stared at him with those wise 8-year-old eyes, processing information that no child should have to understand. "Did it make you feel better?" she asked finally. "What?" "Hurting him. Did it make the sadness about your family go away?" Richard met her gaze, seeing no judgment there, only curiosity. "No. It made everything worse. I felt like a monster, but I couldn't stop." "When did you stop?" "When I met you. When you reminded me what love looked like." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then walked over to his wheelchair and climbed into his lap, something she'd never done before. "Mr. Richard," she said, wrapping her small arms around his neck, "I think you were lost, and now you're found again." Jennifer spoke up. "What happens now? With this Morrison person? He wants me to confess publicly what I did to him. If I don't, he'll tell the story himself. And if you do confess? The foundation is probably finished. My reputation is destroyed. And all of you get dragged through the scandal with me." Rosa had been silent throughout Richard's confession, but now she stood and walked to the coffee machine. "You know what I think?" she said, beginning to make fresh coffee with practiced movements. "I think this Morrison fellow is right." Richard's heart sank. "Rosa, you should tell people what you did. Not because he's forcing you to, but because it's the truth. And the truth is what separates good people from bad people. But the foundation will survive or it won't. But it won't survive built on lies." Rosa turned to face him. "Mr. Richard, you told us that broken people can choose to heal each other. Well, this is part of your healing. People will think I'm a hypocrite, running a foundation for children while having done something so vindictive." Sarah spoke up from his lap. "Mr. Richard, what's a hypocrite? Someone who pretends to be good while actually being bad. But you're not pretending to be good. You are good. You just used to be bad." Sarah's logic was characteristically simple and devastating. "That's not being a hypocrite. That's called learning." Jennifer leaned forward. "Richard, do you regret what you did to Morrison?" "Yes. Deeply." "And if you could go back, would you do it differently?" "Absolutely." "Then you're not the same person who did those things. You're someone who grew beyond them." Jennifer's voice was firm. "I've seen you with my daughter. I've seen how you treat Rosa, how you handle the other children in the program. The man who could do what you did to Morrison is not the man sitting in this cafe right now. But what if no one else sees it that way?" Sarah twisted in his lap to look directly at him. "Then they don't understand about bent parts getting fixed." "But we do." "Sarah's right," Rosa said, returning with fresh coffee. "Some people will understand, and some won't. But the people who matter, the children you're helping, the families you're supporting, they'll understand because they've seen who you really are." Richard felt tears threatening again. "What if I call the press conference and the foundation collapses? What happens to all the kids we're planning to help?" "Then we'll find another way to help them," Jennifer said simply. "Richard, this foundation isn't about you, it's about the work. The work will continue because the need continues, whether your name is on it or not." Richard looked around at these 3 women who had become his family, who had heard the worst thing about him and somehow still believed in his capacity for good. "You're saying I should call the press conference?" "I'm saying you should do what you think is right," Sarah said. "And I think you already know what that is." Richard was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "David? Schedule the press conference for tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'm going to tell them everything." As he hung up, Sarah hugged him tighter. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Why?" "Because choosing to do the right thing when it's scary is the bravest thing there is." Richard held this remarkable child close and realized that no matter what happened tomorrow, he'd already won the only battle that truly mattered, the one for his own soul. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Cleveland Convention Center, but by 9:30, the room was already packed beyond capacity. Word had leaked about Richard's planned confession, and the media presence was overwhelming. Local news stations, national networks, print journalists, and bloggers all crowded into a space designed for half their number. Richard sat backstage in his wheelchair, wearing his best suit but feeling more vulnerable than he had in years. Sarah sat beside him, her small hand resting on his arm, while Jennifer and Rosa flanked them like protective sentries. "You don't have to do this," Jennifer said quietly. "We could still walk away." "No," Richard replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This is exactly what I have to do." Through the curtain, he could see Frank Morrison in the front row, his expression unreadable. The man had expected a private destruction, not a public confession, and clearly didn't know what to make of Richard's choice. "Mr. Richard," Sarah said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Anything. When you tell them about the bad things you did, will you also tell them about the good things that came after?" Richard looked down at this remarkable child who had become his anchor in the storm. "What good things? Tommy doesn't have nightmares anymore. My mom is going to be a nurse. Rosa smiles every day now instead of just sometimes. The foundation has a waiting list of 50 kids who want to join." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "And you remember how to love people again." "Sarah's right," Rosa added. "The story isn't just about what you did wrong. It's about what you learned from doing wrong." Margaret appeared at Richard's elbow. "It's time." As Richard wheeled onto the stage, the room fell silent. The clicking of camera shutters sounded like machine gun fire, and the bright lights made it impossible to see individual faces in the crowd. But he knew they were all there, supporters, critics, and everyone in between, waiting to hear him confess to being less than the saint they'd seen on television. Richard positioned himself behind the podium and looked directly into the cameras. 3.5 years ago, my wife Emma and my 2 children, Michael and Grace, were killed by a drunk driver. Frank Morrison was sentenced to 3 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter, and I thought that would be enough. I thought justice had been served. The room was utterly silent. I was wrong. The sentence didn't bring back my family, and it didn't ease my pain. So I decided to take justice into my own hands. Richard's voice grew stronger, more determined. I used my wealth and connections to systematically destroy Frank Morrison's life after his release from prison. I hired private investigators to harass his family. I used my influence to ensure he couldn't find employment or housing. I turned his attempts at rehabilitation into a nightmare of obstacles and humiliation. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was worse than anyone had expected. I told myself I was seeking justice, but I was really seeking revenge. I wanted Frank Morrison to suffer the way I was suffering, to lose everything the way I had lost everything. Richard paused, looking directly at Frank in the front row. What I did was cruel, vindictive, and wrong. There's no excuse for it, no justification that makes it acceptable. The questions started immediately, reporters shouting over each other, but Richard held up his hand for silence. I'm not finished. 4 weeks ago, I wandered into a small cafe and met an 8-year-old girl named Sarah Chin. She told me that tears are just love with nowhere to go, and for the first time in 3 years I remembered what love felt like. Richard gestured toward the side of the stage, where Sarah, Jennifer, and Rosa waited. These people became my family, not because I bought them, but because they chose to see something worth saving in a broken man. They taught me that the opposite of cruelty isn't justice, it's compassion. And they showed me that the way forward isn't through destroying people who hurt us, but through helping people who need us. Sarah suddenly stepped forward, moving to Richard's side despite the blinding lights and intimidating crowd. Excuse me, she said into the microphone, her clear 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult noise. I have something to say. The room fell completely silent. No one had expected a child to speak. My name is Sarah Chin, and Mr. Richard is my friend. A lot of you are here because you think he's a bad person pretending to be good. But you don't understand something important. Sarah looked directly into the nearest camera with startling intensity. Good people aren't people who never do bad things. Good people are people who learn from bad things and choose to do better. Mr. Richard did something terrible when he was full of sadness and anger. But then he stopped doing terrible things and started doing beautiful things instead. Jennifer and Rosa had moved onto the stage now, flanking Sarah in a show of solidarity that sent a powerful message to the watching crowd. Mr. Richard saved my family, Sarah continued. Not with money, but with love. He gave my mom a chance to go to school so she can help sick people get better. He gave Rosa a reason to smile again after her husband died. He gave me a place where I belong. Sarah turned to look at Frank Morrison in the front row. And now he's trying to save the man who hurt him by telling the truth about what he did wrong. Because that's what love looks like when it grows up. It protects people even when they don't deserve it. Frank Morrison's face had gone pale. Whatever he'd expected from this press conference, it wasn't this 8-year-old girl defending the man who had made his life hell. Sarah faced the crowd again. I don't know if what Mr. Richard did before I met him was right or wrong, because I'm just a kid. But I know that the person he is now saves people instead of hurting them. And I think that's what matters." She handed the microphone back to Richard, then remained at his side, her small presence offering strength he didn't know he needed. "Frank Morrison is here today," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Frank, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you restitution for the damage I caused." Richard pulled out a prepared statement. "Effective immediately, I'm establishing a victim restoration fund with an initial endowment of $5 million. This fund will provide housing, employment assistance, counseling, and educational opportunities for people affected by my actions. Frank Morrison will be the first beneficiary, but not the last." Frank stood up slowly, clearly struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "I also want to say something else," Richard continued, looking directly at Frank. "What you did to my family was wrong, and it destroyed my world. But what I did to you afterward was also wrong, and it perpetuated a cycle of harm that benefited no one. I can't undo either of our choices, but I can choose to break the cycle here and now." Frank Morrison walked toward the stage, and the room held its breath. When he reached the microphone, his voice was shaky but clear. "I came here today planning to destroy Richard Wellington's reputation the way he destroyed my life. But watching him confess his crimes publicly, watching him take responsibility for what he did to me." Frank paused, looking at Sarah, who smiled at him with the fearless kindness that had first captured Richard's heart. "This little girl is right. The question isn't whether we've done terrible things. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them and do better." Frank turned to Richard. "I forgive you. And I hope someday you can forgive me too." Richard felt tears streaming down his face as he wheeled closer to Frank. "I forgave you the moment I remembered how to love again." The two men shook hands as cameras flashed, and the crowd erupted in applause. "The Emma Wellington Foundation will continue," Richard announced over the noise. "But with new leadership. Sarah Chin, at 8 years old, has shown more wisdom about justice and compassion than I possessed at 45. While she's too young to run a foundation, her principles will guide everything we do going forward." As the press conference ended and the crowd began to disperse, Richard found himself surrounded by his chosen family. Sarah hugged him tightly while Jennifer and Rosa beamed with pride. "I'm proud of you," Sarah whispered in his ear. "Why? Because you chose love over fear. That's the hardest choice there is." 6 months later, Richard sat in the expanded Mama Rosa's cafe, watching Sarah teach Tommy and 3 other children how to make Rosa's famous pancakes. The Emma Wellington Foundation now served 43 children from 12 different schools, and the waiting list continued to grow. Frank Morrison worked as the Foundation's community outreach coordinator, his own experience with the justice system making him uniquely qualified to help other people navigate their second chances. Jennifer had graduated from nursing school and worked at Cleveland General, finally able to support her family with dignity and purpose. And Rosa? Rosa had become the grandmother that dozens of children had never known they needed. "Mr. Richard," Sarah said, approaching his table with a plate of perfectly prepared pancakes, "I have something to tell you." "What's that?" "I figured out why you came to our cafe that first day." "Really? Why?" Sarah's smile was radiant as she delivered her final piece of 8-year-old wisdom. "Because sometimes when people are lost, they don't need directions to where they're going. They need directions to where they belong. And you belong with us all along, you just needed to find your way home." Richard pulled Sarah into a hug, marveling at how this small person had saved his life simply by seeing him clearly and loving him anyway. Outside, Cleveland continued its daily rhythm of millions of people working and struggling and hoping for better days. But inside Mama Rosa's cafe, a family that had chosen each other continued the quiet work of proving that love really is stronger than loss, that redemption is possible even for the broken, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful truths. Emma would have loved Sarah, Richard thought as he watched his chosen daughter laugh with joy at some private jokes shared with Rosa. And somehow, he suspected she already did.